week we talked about very, very expensive wines. And we're going to do the same this week, except that there's going to be more focus on wines that actually have a backstory, something interesting about them. And in fact, I've got a lot of the stories from this great book, actually not written by me, and I'll send it to you later on this evening. It's called The History of Wine in 100 Bottles. And it really does have some lovely stories, and I've shamelessly pinched a lot of them this evening. But as I said, last week we spoke about unbelievable prices for wine, $500,000 for one bottle of Screaming Eagle. And we'll be talking about some more what I consider outrageous prices this evening. And a number of people have said, well, why are we having, while we're doing this, why are we having such a cheap wine this evening? Which is indeed what we're doing. We're drinking Primitivo. Primitivo from Apulia, the heel of Italy. It costs less than $6. And I think let's start the evening by pouring a glass. Over the past 10 years, I've been teaching wine classes at the University of Miami, at Books and Books, at the museum. I've probably done about 40 or 50 classes now, and in pretty much every single one, and it's only this evening that I talk, only in this Zoom class that I talk about prices. In my in my real world classes, I never talk about prices, and this has always been consistently the most popular wine at the end of the class. $5.99 at Trader Joe's. You know. So while we're talking about expensive wines tonight, I want us all to appreciate, well, see what you think. It's got a very strong immediate nose. I only opened this half an hour ago, and immediately there's a great deal of fruit coming out. It has that lovely, soft, velvety texture, and again, of fresh fruit. Let's see how it develops. So, well, let's get straight to our PowerPoint slides. Where at the moment I can see you. A number of you, many of you hiding behind your video off, but I can see your names. Ashley, why are you so embarrassed? And Alfredo Cardon, and you're all hiding. Nevertheless, you're all going to vanish now anyway, because, welcome. Ashley, you're younger and lovelier than ever. Ashley and I used to work together, what would it be, more than 20 years ago. So.
Oh gosh, I thought that was 8 years ago, Patrick.
How many?
8, I'm kidding. It's been a while.
Like it was
it's
8.
been a while.
So I'm going to go to the PowerPoint now, and we can see what we are drinking. Let me, okay. So tonight we have Primitivo, and Primitivo is at the boot of Italy, the heel, I guess, of Italy. Meanwhile, over in California, there's a wine called Zinfandel, and across the Adriatic, in Croatia, there's Krishnek Kastelnaski. I'm showing my age here, but way back in the 60s, I hitchhiked down the coast of what was then called Yugoslavia, and I used to drink a this wonderful, wonderful, actually at that age, every wine is wonderful, especially if you're hitchhiking down the coast of, but I do have strong memories. I seem to have vanished here. We have people, I'm sorry, there's people waiting outside. Please come in. Okay, hopefully everyone's here now. I can't see anybody, I can't even see myself. So I hope I'm behaving well. So we have three different wines. We have Castelnacki on the Croatian coast. We have Primitivo in the southern heel of Italy, and we have Zinfandel in California. Zinfandel was always a puzzle. Where did it come from? How come it was it endemic to California? It can't have been. It was Vitis vinifera. It must have come from Europe. So they finally, about 20 years ago, did DNA testing. Technology. We'll get this sorted. There we go. They did DNA testing and realized that all three grapes were exactly the same. So we've sort of reconstructed the history, and basically this unpronounceable Krzyżnak Castelnacki grew down the coast of what is today Croatia, and sometime in probably the late 18th century crossed the Adriatic to southern Italy, where it was eventually renamed Primitivo. Now, I always thought that Primitivo was a derogatory name, meaning it's, it was crude, it was primitive. But apparently that's not the case. From the Latin, it really means the origin. It means early ripening. And that was very important to the southern Italians, because this grape was very early ripening. It was very prodigious. It produced a lot of juice. It had strong body, strong color, and had high alcohol. And therefore, they used to send it up north to Chianti and to Nebbiolo, to the various regions in the north, where they were producing finer wines. But if they had a poor harvest or whatever, then the early ripening Primitivo was very useful for boosting the color and the strength of the wines. So that's the background to Primitivo. In the meantime, if you think about Croatia in the 19th century, it was part of the Austrian Empire, the Hungarian-Austrian Empire, and eventually the vines were taken to Vienna, and at some point they arrived in New York. We have the earliest records of them being of this particular grape being grown in New York State in 1820, where it was used as a grape for the table, something that you eat rather than make wine with. But then in 1849, we had the gold rush. They discovered gold in California, and everybody, all sort of the working people from Europe and also from New York moved over to California, the 49ers, and somebody took with them this vine, and it's a mystery where the name came from, but it was called Zinfandel. And if you remember from class 2, and I'm sure you all do, history class, the only grape grown in California at that time was the mission grape, which was pretty awful. It was used for Catholic Mass, and that was about it. So Zinfandel became the most popular grape in California, and sort of got this idea that it was endemic to the region. And it was only, as I say, about 20 years ago that people worked out that no, it came from the coast of Croatia, and that's what we're drinking now. We're drinking the Primitivo. It's exactly genetically the same as the Zinfandel in California, and exactly genetically the same as the wine which it's now very difficult to find in Croatia, simply because it was decimated by phylloxera and has never really recovered. But anyway, as we go through the evening, and I'm talking to you about horrendously expensive wines, I want you to remind yourselves that you are holding something which costs less than $6 a bottle and tastes Jolly nice. So last week when we ended the class, I went through a list of different Californian wines. We ended up obviously with Screaming Eagle, which was famously sold for $500,000 for a Magnum. Harlan Estates was one of the ones I mentioned. I didn't go into any details, but basically it's I've never had any, but has a tremendous reputation. Janice Robinson is one of the people I most wine critics I most admire. She says it's one of the 10 best wines in the 20th century. Basically, it's released by the vineyard at $800 a bottle, but that's really wholesale. And you or I, if we had the inclination, would probably have to pay $1,200 a bottle. What's interesting, and I want to pursue this, is there is what they call second labels. So if you're a big vineyard and you're producing bottles like this at Harlan Estates, where you're selling them at $800 a bottle, basically if you've got a big vineyard, you've got vines which are maybe 50 or 60 years old, and you get rid of them and you plant new vines, or you buy the next door neighbor's vineyard and you plant vines there. Whatever it is, you've got new vines growing, and they have not yet reached, takes a vine about maybe 5 years before it's reaching its full maturity. So in the meantime, you're producing wine, but not the best, not wines which are good enough to charge $800 a bottle, the new ones. So most big vineyards have what they call second labels. So this one, for example, the Maiden from Harlan Estates only goes for $200 a bottle. It's same wine, it's made by the same people, but it's a cheaper way of doing it. And this is true throughout all the big estates. What I've done here is I've picked the Premier Crus from Bordeaux, the 5 first growth Premier Crus: Chateau Latour, Chateau Lafite, Margaux, Rothschild, and Aubryon. Those are probably out of most of our price range, but they do have secondary wines, second labels, if you like. And that's, as I said, those are younger wines. Or sometimes you've got a big vineyard, but there's a certain part of the vineyard which doesn't get as much sun, or it doesn't have the right soil. For whatever it is, you can't make it what they call in France, in Bordeaux, le grand vin. So you have your secondary vin, and the price changes obviously with it. So and I got these prices from today from Total Wine. So if you want to buy a Chateau Latour, it's $2,150. But they have Le Fort de Latour, again from Total Wine, it's just $300 short. They give you 3 cents change. Those are, and obviously these are Premier Cru Bordeaux, so the prices are, and the difference is like that. The Chateau Lescombe, which is a deuxième cru from Bordeaux, the price difference, I mean, the Grand Vin is only $120 a bottle, and the second label is $69. But just be aware that you can get almost the experience of one of these fabulous wines by going for the second label. And while we're still on the subject, we ended last week by talking about Californian wines. We started off, we ended with the extreme, that Screaming Eagle, where the prices are out of sight, and their whole attitude to marketing is, if you want to buy our wines, you better go back there and stand in line. Inglenook, for example, I was very surprised to find out that this cab sold for 25 grand to Francis Ford Coppola, because when I lived in California in the early 80s, Inglenook really was a jug wine. It was something you drink out of a brown paper bag while you're sitting outside the laundromat. And really, this shows in many ways the history of Californian wines. Back in 1941, and I can't remember the name of the owner, but he was making these fabulous wines, which have been regarded as some of the best ever made, and they're still being drunk. And then he sold out to a large conglomerate, and they went for quantity rather than quality. So by the time that I moved to California in 1980, Inglenook was synonymous with jug wine. Francis Ford Coppola realized the potential of the estate, and he bought it up, and now he's restored it, and it's no longer called Inglenook, just because it had such a bad reputation. But that vineyard is producing it's called Niebaum Coppola Estates. And while we're still on the subject of Californian wineries, this one has a Miami connection because it was designed by Herzog and de Merton, who have built art galleries, parking garage, and various things here in Miami, particularly on Miami Beach. They're big, and this winery is owned by Petrus, and we'll see Chateau Petrus mentioned again and again and again. What we're going to do throughout this evening, and it will remind us from what we discussed with expensive wines last week, the same names keep popping up again and again. And Chateau Petrus is one of those. It's on the left bank of the Gironde. It's of Bordeaux, probably in the top 5. And here's, I have trouble with the, do I say the most expensive, the most sought after, the most fabulous, the most researched? All those superlatives kind of blend together. But whichever one you're using, Chateau Petrus, like Romani Conti and Chateau Latour, all those names always crop up again and again, as we'll see this evening. The big challenge that Herzog and de Herton had was when they first built all of the wineries in the late 70s, when Napa Valley suddenly, won the 1976 challenge. Everyone wanted to own a winery there, whether they were pouring in, and they built all these wineries. And of course, Napa Valley is very hot in the summer, so all air conditioned. So the challenge in the 21st century for Herzog and de Merton was to build a winery for Chateau Petrus in Napa Valley that used no AC. And it's a fabulous building. They've used, you can see in the background there, cages with rocks. The ones we see here are little rocks, so obviously there's very little airflow because they're very tightly packed together. But there's other cages, all designed by computer, where there are larger rocks, and therefore there is good airflow. And you can see from the middle picture, stainless steel. They use, this is built in the 21st century. It is state-of-the-art, money no object, high-tech winery. And by the way, you can't, most wineries, when you drive past, they say, come on in, because they want to give you some wine, and then you buy a few cases. Dominus Winery, you can't visit, except on special invitation. It's highly controlled. But what's interesting is down below in the cellar, they are still using oak barrels. So some things never change. And the value that oak barrels give to wine, that remains exactly as it always has been. And that's why I thought that was an interesting thing to show. By the way, a bottle of Dominus, which is the end product of all of this, costs about $300 per bottle. The other famous California, before we leave California, is Opus One. And if you remember from class number 2, when we did history, we had the Judgment of Paris, where the wine that we drank that evening, Stag's Leap 1, came first, and poor Baron Philippe de Rothschild, who had spent his whole life and his fortune on making his Mouton Rothschild number 1 in the Premier Cru in Bordeaux, came second. Broke his heart. Terrible thing. That was 1976. 1977, he thought about it. 1978, he was in California doing a deal with Robert Mondavi, so Philippe and Robert. And in 1979, 3 years after that terrible Judgment of Paris, they put out Opus 1. And it's been going for about $500 a bottle ever since. Very, very successful. But again, they do have a second label. It's called Overture. And you can pick that one up for a mere $140. Last week, I showed you this ampoule from Penfolds. I find this sort of pretty object. I mean, it's $168,000. And I think spending that it's a little bit obscene. Then there's the idea that there's only 12 of them in the world, and then there's the idea that when you can't open it yourself, you phone up Australia and they send out a chap who comes and opens it for you. But then what are you going to do? I mean, do you say, well, thank you very much, go home now while we drink it? And the whole business, I just find it so pretentious. Now, if it was a marketing thing done by a minor winery, I wouldn't mind so much. But the trouble is, this is Penfolds, and Penfolds produce really, really good wine. The best wine in Australia. And so that ampoule that you see there only holds the 750 milliliters. The same as a normal bottle of wine. That's all you're getting. One bottle of wine within that for $168,000. $168,000. Go online and see what that would, without the ampoule, if you buy it, it's about $500. So in other words, you are spending $167,500 for a glass ampoule. And look at the design of it. There's not much you can do with it after. You can't put flowers in it. It's makes me cross. Makes me particularly cross because Penfolds produce this fabulous wine. Actually, let me read from my excellent book, which you must all know by now. Page 148. And why I feel particularly, why Penfolds Grange is so unique. Perhaps the best example of the anti-terroir approach is Penfolds Grange from Australia. In 1952, Max Schubert, a winemaker employed by Penfolds Winery in South Australia, decided to make a wonderful Australian wine that could compare with the very best French Bordeaux. He chose not to use one of the usual Bordeaux varietals, such as Cabernet Sauvignon, but to use a classic Australian grape, Shiraz. His focus was on extracting from the grape the essence of all the big-bodied fruit that it contained, and using his winemaking skill to produce one of the world's great wines. And he succeeded. Since 1952, Penfolds Grange has been recognized as Australia's iconic wine and one of the world's greatest, with an average price of about $500 per bottle. Now, what's so interesting is that Penfolds completely reject the concept of terroir. The Australians, as you all know, are Britain's convicts. They've never really liked rules. And here they prove it. They completely ignore terroir. Their focus is not on where the grape was grown, but on what it tastes like. The grapes used to make Grange, Penfolds Grange, come from all over South Australia. There's no single vineyard that produces Penfolds Grange. It's the quality of the grape and the skill of the winemaker that counts. Not where it was grown, not the terroir. Terrible. French hate that whole concept, but it's quite unique. And this doesn't, Penfolds Grange doesn't sell for $500 a bottle because it's because it's fashionable. It's simply because that's what the market pays and has done since 1952. What I'm going to be showing you now, you've got the first one here at www.licoristas.com. Various people who put out the 10 best movies of the year. What I've been looking at is the 10 best wines in the world and various people's choices. So this one here, number one, Côte de Nuit, which is, if you remember, the northern part of Burgundy that we looked at 2 classes ago. Number 2, Côte de Nuit. Number 3, Côte de Nuit. These are wines from anywhere in the world. Number 4, Côte de Nuit. Number 5, Côte de Nuit. Then we get a Cheval Blanc from Bordeaux. Then we get Penfolds Grange, which is what I've highlighted here. And finally, Chateau Lafite, again, another Bordeaux. So when we make it, whether you're making a list of the most beautiful actresses in the world, or the best movies in the world, or the best cars in the world, or the best wines in the world, obviously personal choice comes into this. There is no definite answer. So this person, or this particular group, have not only picked Côte de Nuit Burgundies rather than any other wines, but they've also, which I find interesting, they've picked wines made by Lalou, Beats Leroy. And if you remember 2 classes ago, when we were looking at the wines of Burgundy, we had the wines made by Aubrey de Villaine, who featured in that Vanity Fair article that I sent you after the class, and his naughty ex-partner, Lalou. I say naughty, there was some sort of, she was his business partner for a while, and then there was some financial skullduggery in there, and they split up. But she still owns, these are the wines that she owns. And obviously, whoever made this list, that's their preference. Burgundy, Côte de Nuit. So now we go for another list. And made by somebody else. The 10K bottles. So what I've highlighted here in the illustration is Dom Pérignon, which, and we'll talk about champagne in just a moment, but Dom Pérignon is by far and away my favorite champagne. I really love it. The other wine there is Chateau d'Yquem. Chateau d'Yquem, it comes from, it's just south of Bordeaux, is the Sauternes area. And in Sauternes, the grapes are Semillon. They have a thing called, it's called Botrytis cinerea, what was more commonly referred to as noble rot. And at the end of the, just before the harvest, grapes sort of start to shrink, and this chemical change happens, this noble rot, if you like, and it increases the sugar level and increases the eventual alcohol. So it makes very sweet, very powerful alcoholic wines. But of all the Sauternes wines, Chateau d'Yquem is the most exclusive, to the point where they don't pick the bunches. They go out and pick the grapes individually, and they don't do it throughout the day. They go out as soon as the sun rises, so there's enough light to see what they're doing, and then they pick and inspect each grape one by one, and it's finished before the sun gets so high that it's going to affect the heat. Consequently, these are very expensive wines, and we saw last week an example of the owner of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris, who bought a bottle of Chateau d'Yquem for $117,000 for the bottle, making it the most expensive white wine ever sold. And you'll see it says Le Salus. Le Salus is a family that have lived in that area since 1306. Quite a long time. And they've owned Chateau d'Yquem since 1785. And they really are the family that have built up its reputation. I mean, this is the most famous, this is the most popular wine for the Russian Tsars before the revolution. And still the Russian oligarchs still go for it. Unfortunately, in the financial crisis of 2008, 2010, they were forced to sell 50%. So 50% of it is now owned by LVMH. Anyway, that's the background to those two bottles that I've featured there. Let's look at the list. So Chateau Ausson. Ausson was a Latin poet, a Roman poet who was living in Bordeaux about the time of Christ, writing his poetry and planting a vineyard, and that vineyard is still there. I don't know that it's been in continuous production, but that's Chateau Ausson, and it's still, somebody has considered it one of the world's greatest wines. Cheval Blanc, we talked about last week. Chateau d'Yquem, I've just talked about. Haut-Brion, we've mentioned several times. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, Latour, Le Pin, Margaux. Mouton Rothschild, of course, was the one that came second to the Stag's Leap that we drank in class number 2. Chateau Petrus. So all of those come from Bordeaux. So this person obviously has a preference, but let's carry on. We have Dom Perignon, as I said, that's my favorite champagne. And now we come to Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, which we examined in some detail the past 2 weeks. The Richenberg, which is also a Côte de Nuit. The Harlan Estates, which is how we started the evening. That's the very expensive and unique California wine. La Tâche, another Burgundy. Louis Roux Cristal, the most popular with all the hip hop artists today. Opus 1 we've discussed. Penfold Grains we've discussed. Screaming Eagle. And Vega Sicilia we'll discuss a bit later. They're all Bordeaux. So again, people putting out their favorite lists, I'm sure they're very professionally experienced, but everyone has their personal preferences. So now we come to the third list that I'm putting up. This is the one that I identify with most. We've got, again, Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, that's been on all 3 of the lists. Chateau Margaux, that's long been that's probably my favorite of all the Bordeaux wines back in the days when I could afford it. Chateau Petrus, they're the ones that built, that winery that we were looking at just a few minutes ago. Chateau d'Yquem, again, we discussed that a few minutes ago. Dom Perignon, yet again, may I say that's my favorite champagne. Anyone wants to give me a bottle? Penfold's Grange, we discussed that, and Screaming Eagle, of course, we discussed that last week. The 3 which I've highlighted, we're now going to look at in more detail. But otherwise, the usual suspects. Again, we see these same names again and again and again as the world's greatest or most sought after wines. Tenuto San Guido Sassia. When we started this class, we were drinking Brunello de Montalcino, and one of the first things I emphasized was that in Tuscany, you only grow Sangiovese. That's the only grape permitted. And then a couple of weeks later, we discussed Burgundy, and I explained that Pinot Noir, that's it. Otherwise, it's a hanging offense. So I need to modify that a little bit. When I say you're not allowed to grow any other grape, that's not strictly true. It's simply you're not allowed to put it on the label. So in other words, if you've got enough money and you're stupid, you could move to Burgundy, buy a vineyard, or you could move to Tuscany and buy a vineyard and plant whatever you want. No one's going to stop you. It's your land. But what you can't do is go, for example, to Tuscany, which is where this is, and plant Zinfandel. I mean, you can do that, but you can't put it on the label. You can well, you put it on the label and you can say Zinfandel, but you're not allowed to say denominazione d'origine controllata. If you move to what were we drinking in the very first class, Brunello de Montalcino. So you buy a vineyard in Brunello de Montalcino and plant Pinot Noir, plant Zinfandel. And you can do that, and you can sell it, but you can't put DOC Brunello de Montalcino on the label. And by the way, that first class, we were drinking, my recommendation was that we were drinking Brunello de Montalcino, but some of you couldn't find it in the local stores, and some of you were drinking Rosso del Montalcino. And that just struck me, that's another example of a second label. In other words, to make Brunello del Montalcino, the vines have to be 10 years old. So while you're waiting for them to grow and to reach that maturity to produce Brunello, you're still the grapes are there, you're still making wine from it, so you call that Rosso del Montalcino. That's another example of a second label, always useful. So the story behind this, Tenuto San Guido is an estate in Tuscany, and the Marchese de Mario Incesa della Rocchetta, back in just before the Second World War, bought it. Wealthy Italian aristocrat, not interested in selling wine. He wanted to drink wine, and he liked Bordeaux, and he wanted to make his own Bordeaux. And so the land here was very similar to the land in Bordeaux. It's very gravelly. In fact, a large part of the Bordeaux vineyards are called grave, which means gravel. And this area as well is very, very stony and gravelly. And Sassaccia means in Italian stony. So that's what he called his wine, stony. And he planted Bordeaux grapes. He planted Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc. And he did it for himself. He was a wealthy aristocrat. He wasn't selling his wine. So between 1948 and 1967, he was producing these wines, and all the fellow aristocrats in Italy, and probably, from what I believe, aristocrats all know each other all over the place. They were all drinking this wine very happily. It wasn't commercialized. When he died in 1967, his son took over and thought, well, we've got a good thing going here. Let's commercialize it. Let's start selling it, which he started to do in 1971. But of course, he couldn't put DOC on it. It had to be, it was sold without any sort of grandiose, any official title on the label, and it started to be called Super Tuscans because it came from Tuscany and sort of the unofficial word, and they became very successful and very sought after, and a lot of other wineries started doing it because the normal Chiantis had sort of gone down a bit for various reasons. So Super Tuscans, so if you've ever heard of the expression Super Tuscans, that's what it is. In other words, they are grown in Tuscany, but using non-Sangiovese grapes in addition to Sangiovese. But the very first one and the top one is Sassaccia. To the point it became so famous and successful that in 1994, it was officially recognized by the Italian government and given its own DOC. So it's DOC Sassaccia. And in fact, it's the only DOC, Denominazione d'Origine Controllata, in Italy, owned by one family. So it's like, remember we were talking a couple of weeks ago about monopoles. This is the only example of a monopole in Italy. So his family, who owns the Tenuta, Mario and Cesa della Rocetta. They are a member of this very exclusive little group called Premium Familia Vini. There's only 12 members, and you have to be a family that completely owns, not just a vineyard, but a whole AOC. So, for example, Chateau Mouton Rothschild, the Rothschilds, obviously, Philippe's branch of the family, own that. Then Joseph Drouhin, one of the major producers of Burgundy in the Burgundy area. And what's interesting about him is not only is he one of the most respected, but he went to Oregon and has bought a vineyard there. That's how highly they think of the wines of the Pinot Noirs of Oregon. And if you remember, that's what we drank in class number 3 or 4 when we were talking about Pinot Noirs. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a Drouhin, but it is possible to get a Drouhin from Oregon, and much cheaper than the Drouhins from Burgundy. Igor Müller he makes the Trockenbeer-Nauslesen that we were talking about, I think last week, with ridiculous, $14,000 a bottle for a white wine with very low alcohol. Then we've got Tenito San Guido, which we've just been talking about, the Saccia in Tuscany. And next we have Vega Sicilia, which we've mentioned, on the list that we've seen this evening. We've seen that a couple of times. So now we're going to look at that backstory. And the backstory there is very similar to the previous one in Italy. It's from Ribera del Duero, which is on the Duero River, and it's just north of Madrid in Castile. It's got nothing to do with Sicily, by the way. I always thought it had some sort of Sicilian connection. No, Vega means green, and Cecilia is named after Santa Cecilia, who's a patron saint of music. So that's what it is. But it was an aristocratic family that bought up the vineyards and were making the wine, and it's a mixture of Tempranillo, which is the main wine of Spain, but they also brought in some Bordeaux wines, grapes, the Cabernet Sauvignon and such, and just sold to the fellow aristocrats. It was a very aristocratic circle. They did sell them, but it was very sort of not out. It wasn't illegal. It was just something that wasn't for the common people. But it then became famous because the King of Spain, just before I'm not sure which king it was, in the 20th century, because he used a telephone, but prior to the Second World War, when Franco took over, called up because he wanted some for a big international banquet he was giving. And he was told, I'm sorry, you have to wait, we've only a limited supply, you have to go on the waiting list. He said, well, I don't think you understand. I'm the King of Spain. Well, sorry, you have to take a turn like everyone else. So that became a famous story. And then after Franco left and Juan Carlos became king, that became his favorite wine. And he was on a waiting list by then. He was able to get it. Then the Queen of England came over for an official state visit, and the ambassador, the English ambassador in Madrid, called them up wanting to get some Vega Sicilia to serve at the banquet for Her Majesty. And again, she was told, sorry, you have to wait in line like everyone else. So that's the story about Vega Sicilia. Then the third, remember, I had a list and 3 of them were highlighted. This is the third one. Taylor Flaglate Single Harvest Tawny Vintage Port. Now ports, very high in alcohol. They can last a long time. In fact, the oldest one on the market is from a harvest in 1815. It's called the 1815 Fiera. And they've got a few barrels of it still going. So what they do is, every now and again, from the barrel, they fill up a bottle, and then they sell it. And of course, as the barrel gets smaller, or the less and less barrels, and the wine gets older and older, the price goes up and up and up. And the last price for a bottle was in 2019, it was $10,744 for a bottle. But that is the 1815 port. This particular one, but you can see it's beautifully bottled, and it's 3,799. That's just for a bottle. There you go. It's available at Total Wines in North Miami. And if you hurry, it's a limited supply. If you hurry, you can still get a bottle. I'm not sure what time they close. So port isn't that well known in America. It's very much an English thing. For example, we have a tradition, I think I might have mentioned before, when a baby's born, you give the baby a bottle of port. Obviously not to be drunk straight away. It's then the parents put it away, and when the child graduates from university or gets married or gets released from prison, whatever happy occasion it is, then you open it, because port lasts a long time. As you can see, I just mentioned a bottle which has been going, a barrel which has been going since 1815. What we see there is seriously how port is made. It's called a lagares, this sort of large thing that they're all in. So all the grapes are put in, and then they all stand shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, and very slowly and methodically walk through, because don't forget the grapes are up to here. And it's very, very controlled, and they go back, and then they go back the other way, all arm in arm linked, until everything has been broken down. Then they go through, the next thing is called libertad, and they're given sticks, and they break up, they're by themselves, and they just pushing the skins back into it. The object is to try and, because what's happening is that the wine is fermenting at the same time, but they want to interrupt the fermentation when the alcohol and the sugar are about 50%, because they want residual sugar in the juice. And then it's taken off, and some of it's distilled and put back into the juice of the wine, if you like, and that produces something which is 18–20%. But again, as I said, it's not that well known in America. Just the sherry isn't, which is a great pity. Both things are delicious, and those of you who've discovered blue cheese during the course, this course, should try port with Stilton cheese. That's what made my native country great. Champagne. They say that, so here we've got a list of all the different sizes of bottles. I've never had anything bigger than a Magnum, but I'm told that up to Jeroboam, it improves with taste, simply because it's a larger area, there's less oxygen has been able to get to it, and therefore it's better. On the other hand, I'm also, again, I'm repeating what I've read. Once you get beyond a Methuselah, the bottles are so big that they're simply filled up with smaller bottles. So a lot of the quality is lost. And the other thing I'm thinking, let's take the Salmanazar, 12 bottles. Well, if you've carried a case of 12 bottles, you know how heavy that is. So imagine holding one bottle and trying to pour it. And as far as a Goliath or a Midas 36 bottles, 40 bottles. I can't imagine. That's just something where you want presumably a show-off rugby team. The other interesting thing here is what we used to is brewed. And I have no explanation of why, when it gets sweeter and sweeter, they call it dry, as opposed to brut. But brut is what I like. I didn't even know that brut nature. This must be really dry your mouth out. It's so dry. And I think we've discussed already how champagne is made. Maybe I should go back and do that. Well, actually, we'll just discuss that in a minute when we look at the caves. Here we have some really obscene prices, which I think really silly. The Taste of Diamonds for the top, for example, which sold for $2,007 million. It's got 18 karat gold logo on it and a 19 karat diamond. I mean, what are you going to do with a bottle after you've drunk it? To me, it's just so sort of silly. The Armand de Brignac, apparently, I've never had any, but Armand de Brignac has a very good reputation amongst people who are champagne connoisseurs. The quality of the wine really is good. But then when they're putting in a metal bottle and putting gold on it, and it's become very fashionable, apparently, with the hip hop set. So of course the prices are really going up. I find all these prices a little bit silly. On the other hand, I mentioned earlier that I do like Dom Perignon. I have had Dom Perignon a few times in my life, and it really is completely different from all the other sparkling wines. It's fabulous. Again, I checked that today. Local Total Wines, $169 for just a plain simple bottle of Dom Perignon. Maybe if my man wins on November the 3rd, I can imagine a situation where I would consider it worthwhile to spend $169 on a bottle of champagne. I don't know. Anyway, as my wife will assure you, I don't have $169 to spend on a bottle of champagne. So, but I still hope my man wins. Clymidgian Ridge, all along the south coast of England, it's chalk, and goes back millions of years, obviously. It ends when it gets to the White Cliffs of Dover, which we can see here, and then continues across. And by the way, pure coincidence, my eldest daughter spent the weekend up here in Picardy and sent us a photograph this weekend of the French coast, and it looks exactly like that. So this ridge comes all the way down and through Champagne. It actually goes down to Chablis as well, and that's perfect for making champagne, for growing. Champagne is made from Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and also something called Pinot Meunier, which is a form of Pinot Noir. It really thrives on that chalk soil. And Reims, the capital of Champagne, you can see there. That's a photograph of the caves dug by the Romans, actually, underneath the city, which is where they keep all the champagne. And that's what I meant to tell you. The way champagne is made, you can see these, they're called poupettes, they're triangular. And I don't know if you can see, all the bottles are in there and they're down like that, neck down. So they're having a secondary fermentation. It's called remouage. And as the alcohol kills the yeast, it falls into the neck of the bottle, which is why they're held at that angle. And somebody goes along every day, his name is a riddler, and he turns the bottles like this, and that makes sure it all falls down there. And then they freeze the neck, pop out the ice, fill it up, and put in those those big champagne corks with the metal ties to hold it in place. Now with climate change, it's getting warmer further and further north, to the point where they are now, because of course the soil is exactly the same, the very thin soil up here, basically just have goats and sheep, and that's how it is along here. That's where my wife and I actually first met, Brighton, and that's what the countryside is like along here. And the French champagne growers now are buying up land in England and making, of course they can't call it champagne, they have to call it English fizz or sparkling wine. And there's an example. And British Bubbly is actually winning. There's this particular one, $70 a bottle, winning prizes all over the world, actually highly recognized by the French. And that really is something to be recognized by the French. We're going a bit slow tonight, I'm afraid. Tokai. This is, so again, we're talking about wine now with stories behind it. Tokai has been going, it's a very, very powerfully sweet wine. For example, what it says here, the Azu 5 Putunyos. 3 Putunyos is 60 grams per liter of residual sugar. That one, 5 Putunyos, is 120 grams of sugar. They are very, very sweet wines indeed, and have been famous. They're called, as you can see there, it says, Vinum Regnum Rex Vinorum, the wine of kings, the king of wines. To the point that Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria used to give Queen Victoria, on her birthday, a bottle for each month of her life. So in other words, that would be 12 bottles each year. And she died in 1900. She was 81st birthday. So Emperor Franz Joseph gave her 972 bottles of Tokai. I've put here, I find it rather amusing, if you go to YouTube, look up Dracula offers wine, you get this little clip with Lugosi offering Jonathan Harper some wine, which is a Tokai, and he pours him it, and then Jonathan Harper says, aren't you having any? And Dracula, Lugosi says, no, I never drink wine. Shows his teeth. So anyway, it amused me. Here is a bottle of Royal Tokai, and they advertise it as being the most expensive bottle of wine in the world. It's actually 2 bottles in the sense that it's a magnum. So $40,000 a bottle. Strictly speaking, it's $20,000. And the wine itself, the Royal Tokai that they're selling there, is indeed expensive. It costs $2,400 for a bottle. I mean, it's expensive. It's very powerful, very, very sweet, very delicious, I'm sure. But basically, you are paying $37,600 for the decanter. If you're paying $2,400 for the wine. It's a bit like going back to the ampoule of Penfolds, except that I think at least you can use your decanter here. But do you see what I'm trying to get at was, and by the way, when we talk about all these ridiculous prices, doesn't a less than $6 bottle of Primitivo taste better and better? Delicious. So here again, it's the empty presentation rather than the wine itself. Even though the wine in itself here is $2,400 if you buy it in an ordinary bottle. This has got an interesting story. New Zealand is not a wine growing country, not a wine growing culture. It's beer and sheep. However, they, for various reasons, they started growing wine, and they won a prize. They won a prize in England in 1985 as being the best Sauvignon Blanc in the world. They beat the French. Until then, the Sancerre and the Poulet Fumé were, no one questioned, best Sauvignon Blanc in the world. And suddenly, these New Zealanders with no background in wine at all won the prize. They won it again in 1986, 1987, 1988, 1989, year after year after year. It's quite extraordinary, and it put New Zealand on the map. And those of you who know where New Zealand, how far away it is, if you consider how far it is to ship these wines, and yet they do it, and they're very successful, and they continue to. So the world is divided into, not into Biden and Trump, much more significantly divided into French Sauvignon Blanc versus New Zealand. It's very, very passionate. And now I have a very sad story. Mateus Rosé. In Second World War, Portugal was neutral, and which meant that they couldn't, the normal, the market for Portuguese wine has always been England, but they couldn't ship it to England because they were neutral, and the German U-boats were all in the way. They couldn't ship it to America, again, because they'd be sunk. They couldn't sell it. The Spanish didn't want to buy it. What to do? So they decided, well, we've got to open up a market in Brazil. We can get it across to Brazil, and you know the Germans aren't going to sink us. We're neutral. Brazil is neutral. There'll be no problem. So they designed, because they had an awful lot of wine to get rid of. They were pretty desperate to do this. So they designed this special bottle as a flask. It's like the water bottles that soldiers carried in the First World War. They created this, they knew the Brazilian taste well enough that they wanted some sort of pink, slightly fuzzy wine, and that would get rid of what they'd got, because they got a certain amount of white, they got a lot of red, and so they got it all together. Now, marketing. So near where they were putting all this together was a chateau called Chateau Mateus, and they thought, this is beautiful, we can put that on the label. We can call it Mateus, sexy, great marketing, but obviously we need to get the owners to agree. So they went to the owners and said, look, here's a deal. We'd like to put the image of your chateau on our label. We'd like to call it Mateus. What's in it for us? Fair enough. Second World War is going on. This is 1942. Everyone's hard up for money, and you know things are bad. Well, look, we can offer you two things. We can give you cash. We can give you $10,000, or 50 cents. 50 cents for every bottle we sell. How about that? $10,000. They took it. Boom. That was it. Well, since then, it's one of the most popular wines in the world. The Portuguese actually export 3 million cases every year. 3 million cases at 50 cents a bottle would mean there'd be, the Mateus family would be getting $18 million each year. So we don't discuss that at the dinner table when you're invited to Chateau Mateus. A very, very sad story indeed. Yep, they went for the cash. Madeira, we talked about this before. I'm only bringing it up before because it was in 2015. They were knocking down a wall in the Liberty Museum in New Jersey and discovered this cache of Madeira, which had been there since the 18th century. And Madeira, during the colonial times, all the boats that came from Europe to America stopped off in Madeira. It's to do with the winds and you know all that sort of thing. And in Madeira they had a very fortified wine. In other words, they like port, like sherry, was fortified. It was probably 18-20% alcohol. but apart from getting you a little bit more drunk, the importance of that is it lasts longer. The higher the alcohol content, then the longer it lasts. So it was the most popular wine in colonial America, and the independents, Jefferson, Washington, they all loved it. And the funny story for those I know, there's a couple of people here, a few people here in this class who are in Charleston. The first Anglican bishop of Charleston set off with his wife and daughters to take his official position as Bishop of Charleston, and they stopped off in Madeira, where he discovered Madeira. And when the ship went off for Charleston with his wife and his daughters, he stayed behind for about a year. Very, very happy. Eventually, they got him to Charleston, where he was delighted to discover that was the most popular drink in town. Anyway, there's a Charleston angle to everything. This is a book, I've just read a review of it. Apparently Stalin was just collecting wine from all over Europe. He had you can imagine the sort of power that he had. He had all the wine from the Tsars. And he had them stashed in various places. So it's a bit of a mystery. And that's what this book is, written by some Australian. And there's all sorts of dodgy stuff with spies and whatnot. But apparently these cellars, these secret cellars, are still around. And this book, so it's fascinating. But I'm not sure that they actually found it. But there are going to be some great wines in there when they do find them. And this, I thought, was this is one of the oldest wines that has been drunk, 1540, Stein wine. And I love what Hugh Johnson wrote. This brown Madeira-like fluid, again, Madeira, still held the active principles of the life that had been conceived in the sun of that distant summer. For perhaps 2 mouthfuls, we sipped a substance that had lived for over 4 centuries. Before exposure to the air killed it, gave up the ghost and became vinegar in our glasses. He's a great writer. And so, which is the greatest, most expensive, legendary, rare, sought after and delicious wine in the world? Is it New World or Old World? Is it red, white or sparkling? I think, and you've seen all the various lists that people have put up, and you've seen, I think probably it's Romanée Conté. This one seems to be, remember I showed you 3 lists earlier today. I mean, they're slightly arbitrary lists. You could find another 10 lists, I'm sure, if you go online. But I think you will find Domaine Romanée Conté will be on every selection. So, as I showed you that book earlier today, I'm going to send you this evening a list of books that I recommend, but of course, nothing can beat that. So let's open up. I'm going to do that. So, any questions? You're still there. I'm sorry, and I haven't been able to see anybody this evening. Let me unmute you. Maybe you're not muted. Anyone want to ask a question or? Mario, I've just asked to unmute you. I'm not hearing it. Nobody's got any questions?
I will allow it, Patrick.
I'm looking for a way to unmute everybody.
I just wanted to say thank you for everything. It was great class.
That's Pravan, thank you. Okay, so I guess you're all unmuted now.
This has been a great class. When are you doing your next one?
Well, I'm going to send you an email in a moment with the dates of my next one. Unfortunately, it's the same as this one. So, but what I would like is if you've enjoyed it, to recommend it to your friends, and I'll spell that out in my email to you. But what I am thinking of doing, because a few of you have asked, what about white wines? So I'm thinking of putting together just a 1 evening class, just 1 evening where we'll go over white wines. I just need to think how to construct it. And probably instead of having just the one bottle, I'll suggest getting maybe 4 different bottles, because with white wines, for a start, you can invite friends around, and anyway, you can put white wines in the fridge and they will last. And or you can just drink all 4. I mean, it's up to you. Up to you. Very
What
bold
about
mind.
rosé and champagne?
Hmm?
Yeah.
What about rosé and champagne?
Mhm.
Well, actually, somebody suggested that we'll talk about rosé and we'll talk about champagne, but there's so many different whites. I'm still thinking about it, but I think what I would want to achieve in that class is to, while we're all together, actually tasting the different whites. You know, a very dry, a full-bodied, and a sweet. But I'm still haven't. Once you get into champagne has to be drunk that evening. So, whereas if we get, I know someone has to do it. Anyway, I haven't decided yet. So
Yeah. Patrick, couldn't we do 2 nights maybe, or 3 nights on the white wines for those of us who really love them?
sorry, what?
I said, couldn't we do a couple of nights, maybe even 3 on white wines?
My only reservation is, and I haven't planned it. I'm thinking of it. Is there's not so much history. There's not so much interesting things to say about white wines, simply because their lifetime is so much shorter. But you know, if I can get 2 evenings out of it, I'll do that. Otherwise, any other questions? Cheers, by the way. This has been fun. I don't know what I'm going to do next Wednesday.
Patrick Alexander withdrawal.
Yeah, we're gonna have withdrawal.
You're going to have to talk. You're going to have to talk to me.
Well, at least we've got a debate in the next hour or so. We'll take our minds off things. And oddly enough, my next series of classes starts on November the 4th. That wasn't deliberate. But I think we'll all need alcohol.
We need to join.
Patrick, this was one of my favorite classes. I think you have a knack for storytelling, which is why I enjoy sitting and having a drink with you often. Has there ever been a time, like sort of a return of the Judgment of Paris, like where they've kind of done like an anniversary, like let's...
Oh yes, they did it. I mean, the French immediately said, well, look, you know, our wines, they're made to last. Your Californian wines, they're immediate gratification. So they did they didn't do it with the white wines, because white wines don't last, but they did it 10 years later and had the same results. And so they said, okay, well, you know, what's 10 years? So they did it 30 years later, and again, the same results. So I think I sent you a link that had all those details. So, well, all I can say is cheers.
I just want to chime in. We went last year, my wife and I, to Taylor Floodgate in Porto, and we did the whole tour with the winery, and they showed us how they do port and everything. It was really interesting.
Did you see there's a $3,000 bottle you can snap up at Total Wine?
Yeah, when you're done with a tour like Disney World, they have a gift shop, and they give you everything that you could get. We actually got a couple bottles, and we have them here for a special occasion. It was actually very, very interesting. And they have, when you're done with the tour, they give you cheese tasting with port, and then of course you go to the gift shop, and then you can eat, drink, and buy whatever you want.
By the way, how many of you liked tonight's Primitivo?
Oh, yeah.
It was very good. Very good.
And
Yeah, very good.
you see what I mean about why I picked it for tonight, because we're talking all these outrageous prices, and yet forget about less than $10, less than $6. Very, very delicious.
Absolutely.
That is something that my classes can try and emphasize. what I try and
By the
emphasize.
time you pay the tax on it, it's more than $6.
You know, I'm a big believer in cheap wines. So, but then when you find something that you really like, by all means, get a more expensive version and see whether there's a difference and whether you like it. Quite often, not necessary. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Dylan needs me. He's going to burst through the door any minute. So thank you all very much. And I will send you all the PowerPoints. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Patrick, hold on. Cheers.
Thank you.
Don't take.